In this lecture, we continue our examination of qualitative research by focusing on a very general concept in the research approach. And this is there are two terms to describe these next two approaches that we'll see on slides 7, 8, and combining the two on slide number 9. And the first one that we'll examine here is what's called the bottom-up approach in designing research. And this is going to be a very general concept in highlighting one of these two approaches that we'll examine here. Using the bottom-up approach, and that's illustrated here on this schematic on the right-hand side of the slide, where the bottom, or the foundation of our triangle, is where the researcher identifies a problem. And in the bottom-up approach, the researcher might identify some research question based on a problem drawn from their personal experiences, perhaps their own personal observations made within their everyday life, or perhaps through their professional interactions in an academic or non-academic setting. And some examples that would where a researcher might extend those experiences or observations into something that would eventually formulate a research question might include questions related to factors affecting domestic abuse, eating disorders, factors that might help to predict and influence academic success among students. The bottom-up approach is based upon this general concept called inductive reasoning. And with inductive reasoning, the researcher would formulate a question from what's called empirical information. And empirical information refers to information obtained by researchers through direct observations. So this is not generated from theory or analysis. Now, the inductive reasoning approach is one where direct observation, something made very specific, is generalized to a population. And in this example, one might ask the question, I earned a Bachelor of Science degree and can't find a job. This is very specific to one person, and based upon this, what's called a premise, the conclusion that one would draw from this very specific premise is that Bachelor of Science degrees do not help finding jobs. Now, we can see here that the statement is not necessarily accurate, but if one focuses a research approach purely from an inductive reasoning approach, that the conclusions may not be entirely accurate. And so in the next slide, we'll examine the opposite approach. And the opposite approach is what's called the top-down approach. And in the top-down approach, as we see on the diagram on the right here, where we have the triangle that's reversed and the foundation is at the very top. And so in identifying a problem to formulate a research question, the researcher would identify the problem from a theoretical approach, or perhaps from generalized research findings and not one specific case. And the top-down approach is referred to as deductive reasoning. And so one way to remember this is that this approach will deduce a conclusion from theory, and that will help to formulate the research question. And so this approach will generalize to the individual. Now, on slide number 7, we had the individual that we generalized to the population. And to use the same or similar example on slide number 7, we might state that in theory or in a generalized pattern through previous reports for some observation, but very general, it shows that obtaining a Bachelor of Science degree leads to higher level employment. So this is the premise based upon theory, based upon generalized patterns that might be observed. This is the start. Therefore, we would conclude that in a very specific application that I, a single person, a single case, will have high level employment if I earn a Bachelor of Science degree. Now we know that this final conclusion here is certainly not guaranteed, but once again here, and similar to slide number 7, if we focus research purely on a deductive reasoning approach, that our conclusions may not have an optimal level of validity. Now, how can inductive and deductive reasoning be harnessed to formulate a more valid research question? This approach, in combining both deductive and inductive reasoning, would start with deductive reasoning. And in starting this approach, the researcher would investigate various theories, review the literature on previous studies or previous analyses. And as a result of that, the researcher would identify a problem and use that to zero in on a very specific research question. So deductive reasoning in this approach here would conclude with the final research question that has a foundation on the scientific literature and formulated theories. And from that, that is used as a springboard into inductive reasoning. And with inductive reasoning, the researcher would make very specific empirical observations and collect data. Now, I use the term data here in a very general sense. The term data often makes reference to numerical values, and that would be true if this was a quantitative approach, but data is a general term used for information that is gathered. So this is also applicable to the qualitative approach. Now, of course, with the qualitative approach, the data would not be in numerical format, but it still represents information that is gathered. The data would then be subject to analysis, and if this was quantitative, there are statistical approaches that would be used to analyze those data. If it was a qualitative approach, the researchers would transcribe the information that was gathered and use it to examine various patterns in the open-ended responses provided by the research participants. And once those very specific empirical observations are analyzed, the researchers would then arrive at conclusions and generalize the conclusions back to the population from which the sample in the study where the data were obtained and harnessed from were obtained. So we would then make that conclusion back to the population. Moving back to a very specific research approach that is qualitative in nature, the qualitative research is based upon this approach called naturalistic inquiry, from which there are 3 specific approaches. And naturalistic inquiry, as the term suggests, involves a substantial degree of observations in the subject's natural environment and includes 3 approaches called phenomenology, ethnography, and grounded theory that we'll address here in this lecture and in the following lecture. So what we see here are 2 researchers that were dispatched decades ago to different regions of the African continent to study behaviors and patterns in the great apes. Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey were known for their research in which they immersed themselves into the natural setting and the community of the great apes to make those very specific observations. So they did not set up experimental conditions, but rather made observations in a way that attempted to minimize their influence on the natural behavior of the great apes in their habitat. We begin our study of naturalistic inquiry with the first approach called phenomenology. And when we think about phenomenology, we are drawing meaning from complex realities. And so we have these very generally defined items called phenomena. And phenomena are these various entities within which, and various occurrences that exist that are complex in nature. And using this approach here, the phenomenology approach, information is gathered from first-person narratives. And the first step with this approach here is that the researcher should identify key items to investigate. So some examples of general phenomena include schizophrenia from a psychological perspective. Another psychological item that might be that researchers might be interested in investigating include delusional disorders, perhaps physical disabilities. So what we see here are three examples of these phenomena, these very general yet very complex items that would necessitate a second step. And the second step is to begin narrowing the specific types of the major items. So as an example, if a researcher is interested in delusional disorders, three different types, unique types of delusional disorders include erotomanic, grandiose, and jealous. And so a researcher that captures their first level of interest would then begin to zero in and narrow the study of this particular phenomena called delusional disorders. And the phenomenology would indicate that a researcher would examine these a particular type of delusion, a particular type of delusional disorder from the research participants or the individual's social context. Another example that will make reference back to an earlier lecture here in this unit here is the open concept workspace. And so a researcher would examine this phenomenon of the open workspace concept by examining factors that would contribute to stress, discontentment among the employees if it does exist. And so the open concept workspace is, as a phenomenon, is very general and complex. It consists of many parts. Those parts are many of those parts are static. Many of those parts are very dynamic. And so now we have a very large, very general phenomenon that would force the researchers to begin the process of zeroing in on the second step of perhaps examining stress among the employees or stress among the supervisors in that work environment. Another example would be discontentment. The next type of naturalistic approach to take with naturalistic inquiry is what's called ethnography. And ethnography specifically studies attitudes, beliefs, and linking those to behaviors within certain communities and certain groups. And this involves examining those attitudes, beliefs, and linking those to behaviors of a very specific group of people within a social context. And in this regard, the researcher would have to immerse themselves into the participants' way of life. And doing so, this would allow the researcher to examine those social factors that would shape the behavior. Now, in doing so, the researcher would begin to discover new questions that would emerge as information is collected. And so what we see here on the bottom left-hand part of the slide is a photo of a researcher. Hard to pick out who the researcher is here in this photo, but the researcher is immersed within this indigenous community and engage in various activities that a community would normally participate in. And so as a general theme here, we see a researcher, as we saw with the example of Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey, ensuring to minimize their inclusion that would affect the behaviors within the social context of the community that is being studied. On the bottom right hand, another example of ethnography on the bottom right hand side of the slide. What you're seeing here is the poster from a movie produced in 1982 called Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And this was a movie that was based on a book written by Cameron Crowe, who has since been a movie director and producer. And Cameron Crowe immersed himself into a high school in Southern California because of his interest in writing a book that describes teenage behaviors in the early 1980s. And from that book produced what's called a cult classic in this Fast Times at Ridgemont High. And so in posing as a high school student, Cameron Crowe was able to document and describe the behaviors of the teenagers in that social context. So this ends this portion of our unit here on qualitative research and preparation for the third and final lecture.